Hello and welcome to this Astranti YouTube video on the product life cycle. This is one of many videos that we are going to be posting and of ones that we have already posted relating to the CIMA syllabus. We've got videos relating to the objective test exams. We've got ones relating to the case study exams, some focusing on specific parts of the syllabus and others focusing on general technique. And if you like this video and you want to see more of these sorts of videos, then please like the video and hit the subscribe button at the bottom of your screen. And in this video, we're going to look specifically at the product life cycle, one of the most important topics and general principles within the CIMA syllabus, and features heavily throughout your exams and actually has a lot of focus in the case studies as well. And just as with plants, as with animals, as with humans, there is different stages throughout the life cycle when it comes to a product. Just as with a human, you have the stage of your life where you're a baby, then when you're a child, then when you're an adult, and then when you are elderly. And just like that, a product can move through a cycle just as a human will move through a cycle over the course of their life. And this analogy can be applied to both the individual product and also the industry in which the product is part of. And the product life cycle looks a bit like this. It's an axis with sales on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And the product changes over the course of the life cycle. We're going to look at each stage individually, starting with the development stage. Now, the development stage is very much, as the name would suggest, the introduction. It's where the product is being created, where it is going through research and development, perhaps analysis into the market, or in the laboratory devising the actual product, if it was a technological item or a pharmaceutical item, etc. And at this stage, we would expect to see no sales whatsoever. So there's no sales on the development stage. But we would expect to see a loss, because whilst there are no sales, there's no incoming, there's no revenue being generated, there is a lot of cost. And so actually, at this stage, a product would be making quite a significant loss. But then comes the introductory stage. And the introductory stage is where the item is being introduced to the market. And at this point, there would be very high cost still, because the product is still being created. It's still being devised. Economies of scale haven't taken a hold yet. It's still very expensive to produce this product. And you would expect to see very low sales, because the product is not known by the populace as a whole, and also it was likely to be very expensive to cover the different costs. And so generally at this stage, often a pricing skimming strategy is implemented. And a pricing skimming strategy is where a very high price is charged to capitalize on those early adopters. And this is particularly relevant for tech products. If you think of the latest television or the latest computer, the latest iPhone, etc., it's charged at a very high price because there are a certain group of people who will pay that price regardless of how much it costs. They are the early adopters. They want to have the best technology as early as possible. Now, the general public aren't that interested at the moment, but the early adopters are willing to pay that very high price. And so at this stage, we see that sales are starting to pick up, but profits are continuing to decrease, or losses are continuing to increase, as I should say, as we have a lot of costs involved in trying to get this product to the market, and we're not actually generating that much revenue yet. And that brings us on to the next stage, which is the growth stage. And in the growth stage, costs will still be quite high, but sales will be starting to pick up. And this is where sales start to pick up quite quickly, because there is often a boom when a particular product or particular industry is growing. So, for example, If you think back to the early 2000s when the iPod came out and there was an MP3 boom, and every single tech company and lots of other individual companies as well were all creating various different MP3 players because they were all trying to get a hold of this market. And so the reason why costs are still high here is because you're still trying to meet demand. You're not at that stage where you are accustomed to producing your product, so you're producing it far more quickly. You're still going to have higher variable costs here. And often an organization would try to use a market penetration strategy at this point. And a market penetration strategy is where you price at a low margin because you are trying to increase your market share rather than trying to increase your profit. And so profits as well at this stage can often be quite low. But it's very important because remember that there's lots of different companies trying to produce the same product. Then you have to, in a sense, do something that attracts the market to you, that attracts the consumer to you. And that's why often products are priced quite low to try and get that market share. And often towards the end of the growth phase, you'll end up having what is known as the shakeout. And the shakeout is where the market has been growing and the growth starts to slow down and the unsuccessful companies pull out of the market. Again, using the MP3 example, where there were so many different MP3 producers producing different MP3 playing products. And as it started to become apparent that mainly it was just going to be iPods and phones that were going to be the key device to play MP3s on, a lot of all those other companies disappeared. It was no longer profitable for them to be in the market. And so at the growth stage of the product life cycle, expect to see sales picking up very quickly indeed. And also profit starting to pick up now. Still not making much profit, but in a sense the groundwork has all been done now when the product is now established in the marketplace and there is now a market share. And that brings us on to the prime stage of the product's life, which is the maturity phase. And the maturity phase is post the shakeout, so there's a lot less competitors in the market. The products that are still there are the established products. So again, going back to the analogy of the MP3 players, this would be your iPod. The iPod was the established product in the MP3 market. Costs are a lot lower now because the companies are able to produce en masse. They've now become accustomed to producing it. They're taking advantage of economies of scale. So they're producing a lot more cheaply per unit. And therefore the sales and the profit would expect it to be quite high because we're producing a lot more products for a lot less and the products are selling well. And this is where the market is generally starting to consolidate. So we're not growing anymore. We are taking our slice of the pie, as it were, with all the other competitors in the market. And because of that, sometimes there can be a lot of competition in the maturity stage because as the market has started to slow down, as the growth of the market has started to slow down, the only way to continue growing is to take another established product's market share. But in spite of that, this is the prime phase for a product. This is where sales aren't growing particularly, but they are still very high. And this is where you're really getting that profit, where the product is really starting to pay for itself. But all good things must come to an end, and ultimately you then end up with the decline stage. And once a product hits the decline stage, there are a few things that are possible, a few possible strategies for a product once it is entering the decline phase. And this is to harvest. This is where an organization would keep its costs low, continue to sell its products at the same price, and just try and make as much profit, as many sales as they can before the market eventually disappears. Divest. This is where a company will look at the market and think it's no longer profitable to be in that market. We're continuing to make a loss, or we're starting to make a loss and that loss is going to continue, it's actually hurting our company to keep producing this product, to keep being in this market. Let's pull out, and all the costs that we had been providing, or all the costs that we've been accumulating in this particular market, we can now put elsewhere. Or there's a niche. This is where the company will perhaps rebrand or remarket or even adjust their product to appeal to a very specific market and keep selling to that market. So they're extending the life cycle by creating a very niche area for it. And an example of this, again, with MP3 players was when the iPod, they rebranded the original iPod as the iPod Classic. They upped the amount of songs that it could play. They marketed it more specifically to individuals who were interested in music, who perhaps played their own instruments, whereas the rest of the market had moved on to using iPhones because of all the other additional features. But the iPod Classic was still being marketed to a particular niche market and continued to sell well to that market. And in this phase, we see sales and profits start to decline, eventually to zero, at which point the market, the product will end for that particular product. And as good as this is, there are a few limitations to using the product life cycle. The key limitations being that this is very much in a vacuum. And reality is really not that predictable. You can't simply say, well, we'll introduce our product to the market in 1 year's time because it will be completely developed in 1 year's time. Then the growth stage will last for approximately 2 years. And then we will survive the shakeout and we'll have a nice profitable maturity phase of several years before we start to decline it. It's very difficult to decide exactly or to create your plan, prepare budget with that in mind, because reality isn't always that predictable. For example, again, I keep using the MP3 example, the Microsoft Zune. Microsoft was a huge company, or still is a huge company, and they thought that their Zune, which was in many ways a better product than the Apple iPod, simply didn't sell well because it was too late to the market, and as a result, no one wanted it, no one was interested in it at all. And as a result, there was just simply no market for it, and they pulled out the market very quickly. Now, I'm sure Microsoft had predicted far better sales and a far longer product life cycle for the Zune than they actually ended up getting in reality. So it's not always that predictable. Also, some products can be skipped. Some stages can be skipped by certain products, and therefore the use of the product lifecycle as a whole falls flat. So, for example, if you think about the iPad was hotly anticipated, and Apple was becoming a very big company at the time the iPad was introduced, and everyone was aware of this fantastic tablet computer that was coming. And so once the iPad was eventually released, there was no introduction. It was already such demand for it that it jumped straight into the growth phase because there was such a demand for it already. And just a note on the product life cycle as well, that it can be used for the industry as a whole. And when you're thinking about the industry as a whole, again, talking about the different stages, talking about reality is different than for an individual product. So, for example, if you look at the beer industry, now the beer industry is in decline. People aren't drinking as much beer because it's not particularly good for you, or there are perhaps negative connotations about beer drinking, and pub industries within the UK particularly are declining. But the industry for beer has gone for thousands of years. People used to drink beer hundreds of years ago. So the decline phase may last for hundreds of years for the beer industry. It's not as simple as an MP3 player that as soon as phones came out, or smartphones came out, no one was interested in MP3 players anymore and it ended overnight. The decline phase for beer may last hundreds of years. So it's quite difficult to look at this in a binary sense of, oh, our product's in a decline phase, therefore we need to pull out of the market. Drinks companies are not going to be pulling out of the beer market simply because the beer industry is in decline, because that decline could last for hundreds of years. There's plenty of profit to be made in that decline phase. And one of the reasons why an organization would look at the product life cycle for the industry or for the individual product is to look at ways in which they can maximize the profit over the entire lifetime. And they could do this by considering costs early, considering costs in the design phase. Often a product will incur a lot of its costs in that initial research development phase. So by looking at the product life cycle, looking at how much profit they expect to make over the lifetime, gives them a good idea of how much cost they can incur in this design phase. And they may decide that they want to look at ways to cut costs earlier on as a result of it. So if a car manufacturer is looking at producing a new car and the machines, the automation they have available at the time is less efficient, but they expect this car to make a huge amount of profit to last for many, many years, they may decide that it's actually worth investing in new machinery now to maximize profitability in the long term. Also, it's very important to look at ways in which you can bring a product to market sooner. A McKinsey study actually showed that a late release for a product can be far more damaging to a product's overall profitability than by correcting issues once it's already in the market. If you look at Microsoft often provide patches to deal with faults in software after it has been released, because it's more profitable to release a product and deal with those faults later, as long as they're minor faults that is, than it is to spend so much time making a product absolutely perfect before you send it to the market. And a company may also look at ways in which they could extend the product life cycle. So I use the iPod example, the iPod Classic example earlier, where an organization may redesign a product to extend the life cycle rather than going back to the drawing board and creating a brand new product and introducing it to the market. They make simple adjustments. For example, PlayStation, at the time of recording this video, the PlayStation 5 was a year or two away from being released, but at the midpoint of the PlayStation 4 cycle, they created two variations on the PlayStation. They created one that was better, that had some of the components that were going to eventually be in the PlayStation 5, so it was a better console than the original PlayStation 4. And because they had got so accustomed to producing the PlayStation 4 and were taking advantage of economies of scale, they were able to reduce the size of the PlayStation 4 and sell a cheaper budgeted version of it. And the same thing has been done by Apple before, where at the midpoint between a certain phone cycle, say the iPhone 7 or the iPhone 8, at the midpoint between the original iPhone 7 being produced and the iPhone 8 coming out, they produced a 7S, which was a better version of the 7 that was going to have some of the updates that were going to be present in the iPhone 8, and they produced a budget version which was able to appeal to perhaps a market that weren't as willing to spend so much on the iPhone 7. So that's a way in which you can take the same product and extend the life cycle by producing slight variations of it. So that's the product life cycle. I hope you now have a good idea of what the product life cycle is, looking at the various different stages of it. So what kinds of things happen in the introductory stage when we have high costs and low sales, different strategies we implement, a price skimming strategy, and then follow that product through the growth stage where costs are still high but sales are starting to pick up, the maturity stage where the product is established, and finally looking at the various different options that an organization may have in the decline phase. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and more importantly you have found it useful. If you would like to see more videos like this, please visit the website www.astranti.com and also like and subscribe on the Astranti YouTube channel below.